Welcome, everyone. I am Michael Williams, a professor emeritus in the Jackson School's Comparative Religion program and the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to have just a few introductory remarks to begin this book launch webinar for the new book by my friend and colleague, Mika Ahuvia. A few things need to be said at the beginning. First of all, it's important that I mention that the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I also need to note that this book launch event is made possible by the generous support of the community of donors to the Strom Center. Many of you are in the audience today, and on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for your generosity. Today's talk would also not be possible without a group of professionals at the Strom Center who work every day to bring quality, thought-provoking, and academic programming to new audiences. Those professionals include Sarah Zaitis Rosen, Kara Schoonmaker, Grace Elizabeth D., and Rosa Lasley. Also co-sponsoring today's webinar are the Jackson School of International Studies and the school's Comparative Religion program. In order to keep the focus on the presentation, attendees in this Zoom webinar do not have video and microphone enabled, but we welcome you to submit questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. That will be at a later time in this session. I'll start with a formal, the program will start with a formal interview between Sigal Samuel and Mika Ahuvia, and after that, we'll have time for audience Q&A. Sigal Samuel is a senior reporter at Vox, with a V, and co-host of the Future Perfect podcast. Previously, she was religion editor at The Atlantic, opinion editor at Forward, and associate editor at The Daily Beast. Sigal is also the author of two books, Osnat and Her Dove, which is a children's book about the world's first female rabbi, and The Mystics of Mile End, a novel about a dysfunctional family's dealing with mysticism, madness, and mathematics in Montreal. Alliterative characterization. Professor Mika Ahuvia researches the formative history of Jewish and Christian communities in the ancient Mediterranean world. Specializing in late antique Jewish history, she works with rabbinic sources, liturgical poetry, magical texts, early mystical literature, and archaeological evidence. Her book, which will be the focus of this webinar, On My Right, Michael, and On My Left, Gabriel, Angels in Ancient Jewish Culture, investigates conceptions of angels in foundational Jewish texts and ritual sources. In the book, Professor Ahuvia uncovers how angels made their way into the practices and worldviews of ancient Jews. And she makes sense of why angels continue to play such an important role within and outside of institutional religious settings. The audience should see a promo or source code on the PowerPoint slide currently visible. This is a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. I think you'll find it fascinating. Mika teaches courses in Jewish studies, comparative religion, and Global Studies in the Jackson School of International Studies, and is also the Strom Center's undergraduate program coordinator. And so with that, I pass the baton to Mika, who will begin with some opening remarks. Mika, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you all for being here. Thank you, Sigal. I'll quickly share my screen. Should be really good at this by now. Perfect. There we go. Okay. So again, thank you all for being here. I think there were over 100 of you in the audience, and if you're watching later, thank you also for watching. We're not, really in a room together as I wish we could be, but we are in community. So I like starting this presentation just with a little bit of statistics. According to this poll from 2011, nearly 8 in 10 Americans believe in angels. It's actually 77%. And if that sounds strange to you, maybe that tells you something about the particular community that you're in. When I used to give live presentations on angels, I often had audience members come up to me and share their personal experiences with angels, like angels saving them during car crashes and other kind of important times in their lives. So as a scholar of religion, I don't take a position on whether angels are real or not, but I can say that for most of history, for most people, angels were real presences. So that brings up the question, what are angels? I think when many Americans hear the word angels, they think about these cute cherubim or Hallmark cards. But if you asked people 2,500 years ago about angels, they might be thinking about a figure more like this one on the right from ancient Assyria. So the Hebrew Bible's earliest mention of this cherubim figure is as a guardian figure with a flaming sword guarding the exit to Eden, the Garden of Eden. So it's clear that the way people visualize angels has a lot to do with cultural trends around them. And there's no one definition for angels that works across all cultures, across all times, even as most religious communities seem to have some conception of mediating beings. So let me try to focus down on what angels are for ancient Jews. Based on my analysis of the Jewish sources, I can say that angels were imagined as powerful beings who were subordinate to God and acted in alignment with divine will. They were imagined to be always present with the people of ancient Israel, carrying their prayers to the heavens, always available for the faithful in their times of need. Jews imagined angels of good and angels of evil, that is to say, angels who monitored evil all around them. So although people today tend to think of angels and demons as inseparable, ancient people imagine angels kind of separately and without, always correlating them with demons. Angels played a kind of a variety of roles in their lives. And it was clear to ancient people that, the angels might have lived up in the heavens, but they always had obligations here on earth and duties that called them to help out humanity. So you can see in these three images I collected from 3rd century CE cemetery in Beth She'arim, from a synagogue until in the 5th century. And this is the cover of my book. This is another sarcophagus or a burial tomb from Rome. That, again, Jews seem to have imagined angels in connection with the Greco-Roman trend of their own time, right, as winged beings. Even though, actually, modern people are a lot more obsessed with what angels looked like than ancient people. I don't see a lot of discussion in ancient texts with what angels looked like. So what's the argument of my book? Just really briefly, I argue that belief in angels as intermediaries, guardians, and role models was common among late antique Jews. And by late antique, I mean from the 2nd century CE to the 6th century CE. I see this as really kind of foundational time in the development of Judaism. Secondly, I argue that we have to look beyond the rabbis and rabbinic texts to reconstruct Jewish society and Jewish culture. Meaning we have to look at ritual magical texts, at synagogue poetry, and even esoteric mystical texts to really understand Jewish culture and understand the role of angels in Jewish culture. And finally, when we do that, right, when we do look at all of this evidence, I argue that we can see that the rabbinic ideas about angels develop over time and in conversation with other sectors of Jewish society. So just to give you kind of an outline of my book really quickly, I have an introduction with a biblical background to angels. And then my first 2 chapters are actually about ancient Jewish magic. So I focus on Babylonian incantation bowls. You can see a picture of it here. And I know Sigal will ask me lots of questions about those. I look at amulets, right? Like necklace amulets from the Levant, which is, like modern Israel, Jordan, Syria, even as far as Turkey. All of these usually in Jewish Aramaic and Hebrew. We look at angels in early rabbinic texts, where I argue that we see the rabbis at first really trying to downplay angels. We see in rabbinic texts sort of this desire to tell Jews to imitate God and not angels. And then turning to the synagogue, I show that there's an opposite tendency to really encourage Jews to see themselves as angels and imitating angels. So I show then how Babylonian rabbis are kind of reacting to these trends elsewhere. And finally, my 7th chapter is about Jewish mystics who are just take obsession with angels to new heights and depths. And in my conclusion, I try to kind of situate angels in Judaism within the religions of late antiquity more broadly. Okay, so before we jump into the ancient evidence, I want to share with you a part of my book that actually was cut out. So this is about 20th century views of angels, because what I found when I shared my research with audiences was that they would say, okay, we see you've shown us like all of this evidence for angels in ancient Judaism, but how did we get here? Like, how is it possible that, I had a great Jewish education and I've never heard of angels? So I have found this is a barrier that just needs to be overcome. So I'm going to start with that, and then we can get into the ancient evidence. So in the 20th century, I see 3 coexisting Jewish views of angels. One, where angels are present and there's no problem. A second position, which starts to be skeptical of the ability of angels to actually help out in Jewish life. And then a third view that's trying to present Judaism as rational, monotheistic, and without angels at all. So let's look at each of these 3 views. So to represent the view that angels were common in ancient people's life, I wanted to begin with a painting by Marc Chagall. It's called The Apparition, painted it in 1918. If you look at this image, you can hopefully make out the angel kind of in blue and white in the top right corner. Marc Chagall is probably the most famous Jewish painter of the 20th century. He was born to a Hasidic Jewish family in Vitebsk, Belarus, and his paintings really honor and celebrate a Jewish way of life that was kind of going extinct before his eyes. He painted many biblical scenes with winged angels, but also angels hovering over shtetls and villages, angels in flights. They're really quite beautiful and evocative paintings. In his autobiography, which he wrote when he was 35, he describes a dream vision he had of an angelic visitation. And so I'm going to quote from his autobiography. "Suddenly, the ceiling opens and a winged creature descends with great commotion, filling the room with movement and clouds, a swish of wings fluttering. I think an angel. I can't open my eyes. It's too bright, too luminous." End quote. So I love that quotation, right? Because he's saying that he can't open his eyes, and yet it's so visual in its description. And this painting, he says, is based on this dream visitation he had by an angel. What really strikes me about reading his autobiography is that Chagall felt no need to explain his vision to a skeptical audience. It was as if he thought it was obvious to his audience that like this needed no explanation. He just had an experience of an angelic visitation. So this painting might not be very well known to you. Maybe this one is a little more famous. This is Paul Klee's Angelus Novus from 1920. The art critic Jason Farago has observed that this image is more fully understood as a myth than as a work of art. Because right, if you just look at this image, it's not a very impressive angel, right? It has bird's feet and claws. It has very small wings. It has scroll-like hair. It's no Michelangelo or Caravaggio. But what made this image famous is that Walter Benjamin called it the angel of history. What does that mean? Let's look at this. It's a very brief fragment of an idea that he wrote down. Benjamin had been in possession of this image for almost 20 years, but only in the middle of kind of World War II did he give it this description that would lift it to the realm of the mythical. So let's read how Walter Benjamin saw this image. He said, a Klee painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned toward the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay awake, awaken the dead and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. So what I see in this description from Walter Benjamin is something new. This idea of an angel conscious of history, unable to handle humanity's deeds, and powerless in a world completely out of order. So obviously, right, this is a reaction to World War II. The fall of France spelled disaster for refugees. Like Benjamin, he had already been imprisoned. He ends up committing suicide while fleeing the Nazis during World War II. And just before he fled Paris, he actually left his papers and this image with the author George Bataille, who ends up passing it on to philosopher Theodore Adorno, who then passes it on to the Kabbalist Gershom Scholem. So it has quite the lineage, and it's from Gershom Scholem's widow that it comes into the possession of the Israel Museum in 1987. But it's really, I think, Walter Benjamin's description of the angel of history that lifts this image into the mythical realm, and in turn inspires Tony Kushner's Angels in America. So many of you might know this very famous play. It deals with another catastrophe, the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. And as we saw with Walter Benjamin, the Jewish playwright Tony Kushner envisions angels as unable to handle humanity's disasters and catastrophes. These are angels that feel abandoned by God, that are powerless and need to commission a human to be their prophet and spokesman. Okay, so those are two views in the 20th century. Now, the third one, I think, is represented by the scholars who contributed to the Jewish Encyclopedia of 1896, as well as this very famous book, The Religion of Israel. So at the same time as Chagall is believing in angels without problem, and Walter Benjamin is feeling skeptical of angels, other Jewish studies scholars are trying to emphasize that Judaism is rational, it's modern, it's monotheistic, and they're really trying to write angels out of Jewish religion. They're really trying to prove that Jews and Judaism are suited to the modern nation state. And invisible beings like angels are seen as being incompatible with representative democracy. So this has to do with larger trends in American religion. The historian of religion, Robert Orsi, has written about this, that all religions that have kind of intermediate figures are treated with skepticism in the modern nation state, right? Where elected officials are supposed to be the ones mediating human needs. Now, the problem with this perspective on Judaism, which I think through Yechezkel Kaufman became very common at the Jewish Theological Seminary and through JTS was kind of disseminated to Jews across America, is that it leaves Jews with a very partial view of Judaism, right? Like, how can Jews who've been told that Jews are totally rational and monotheistic make sense of these amulets that we find, like, for example, from the Israel Museum from Iraq or from Yemen, right? Amulets are very common. How can Jews make sense of a song that they sing on a Friday night, right, called Shalom Aleichem, that really welcomes angels into the home? How can Jews make sense of liturgical prayer, which again invokes imitating the angels? So I think really understanding how angels came to be a part of Jewish religion is important to making sense of how Jews came to where they are today. So I'm excited to talk to Sigal more about that now. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Professor Ahuvia, for that fascinating overview. I'm especially happy that you mentioned the angel of history and read us that little passage. It's one of my favorites. And everyone in the audience, I just want to say, first of all, thank you again for coming. As you're listening to Professor Ahuvia and to the two of us discussing her work, please feel free to put in the Q&A box any questions that occur to you, because in a little bit, I'll pick up on whatever questions you want to ask Professor Ahuvia. I'm sure many questions will come to mind. Apologies in advance if we don't get to each and every one of them just due to time constraints, but we will do our best. So I guess the first thing I just want to ask is, you study ancient religion. There's a lot of different topics you could have chosen to really delve into. Why angels? What about this topic spoke to you on a personal level?
Yeah, so I have to say it was kind of an inspiration that kept coming, right? I started graduate school with many questions, but I remember sitting in a class about Roman religion, and my professor, Harriet Flower, was talking about how ancient Romans really feared stumbling into gods and goddesses. Like you stumble into a sacred spring and suddenly there's a goddess. And I kind of, that image really stuck with me. And I was taking another class with historian Peter Brown, and he talked about how for Christians, angels hovered 40 feet above the ground. And he kind of gave the example of like the local chapel on campus. They were that high. And I was like, how is it possible that ancient people like went from like being worried about stumbling into spirits to like imagining them, at the top of columns or something? And why is it that I keep reading about, like, oh, by the way, Jews also lived in a world full of angels, but like nobody explained what that looked like. And so I was just so curious. So like, I didn't grow up believing in angels. So like, what is the evidence for what it actually would have felt like to have experienced a world full of angels? And once I started just asking that question, then suddenly like this evidence really started kind of speaking to me, and I realized there was a lot of it. So yeah, I have spent the last 10 years of my life working on providing the answers.
Wow, I admire your persistence, first of all. And yeah, what you're saying about how the ancients, really took this for granted. You write in the book, ancient people took for granted that the invisible realm was crowded with mediating beings, invisible mediating beings. That word crowded resonated for me, or sort of stood out to me, because it evokes in my imagination this like bustling world. Like you can't even move four feet without kind of bumping into an angel by accident. And in the sources that you present in your book, it's just like angels are in heaven, but they're also in the synagogue. They're also in the street. They're in your house. They're even potentially accompanying you into the bathroom, according to some rabbis.
Yeah.
But you really lay out in the early chapters how the early rabbis seriously tried to downplay the importance of angels. Why did they do that? What is at stake for them in that conception of Judaism?
Yeah, I wish they would just come out and say it. I kind of had to read between the lines, but what I did notice is that it's really only very early rabbinic sources that try to downplay angels, and that really stands out in the ancient world because no one else is embarrassed by angels. It's only among kind of the early rabbinic texts, and those of you who know the Passover Haggadah, recognized, right? Not by the hands of a seraph, not by hands of an angel, but like God himself, right? So it was that refrain that got me thinking, like, this isn't about angels not existing. It's clear that the rabbis believe angels exist. It's that they're really concerned about Jews' relationship with God, and specifically with God alone. And so what that suggested to me was that, like, this was a time where, after the destruction of the temple, Jewish authorities, are in a kind of a state of turmoil. I mean, they have this like kind of patriarch leader for a couple centuries, but then the Byzantine authorities outlaw that. So it's a time where like there's not a lot of stability with Jewish authority, and maybe like a lot of Jews are questioning their relationship to God, whether God is still there for them. And so I see the rabbis really trying to assure Jews that God still loves them and that they can turn to God alone in their prayers, that they don't need the angels. But reading between the lines, Jews prefer talking to the angels.
Is there potentially also like some anxiety about really like sharpening and honing what feels unique about Judaism? We are about monotheism, right? Like we're not about all these many other beings that you can, look up to. Is there potentially something about wanting to really crystallize the value add of Judaism that might be motivating the ancient rabbis?
I mean, I think, I see that concern like as more of like a modern concern. Like I don't see the rabbis making statements like that because they rarely acknowledge their enemies, like they don't really acknowledge that Christianity is like gaining power in Roman Palestine. Like they talk about like stumbling into apostates and stuff, but it's not like a threat that they directly address ever. So you only see Jews kind of trying to make statements about like, Judaism is a religion of law and Christianity is a religion of dogma. Like that's a very modern thing to say, right? That was quoting Moses Mendelssohn. That's you don't see rabbis trying to make global statements about what Judaism is and what makes it unique. I do find it interesting. Like, Jews clearly believe that Michael was the prince of their nation, right? Gabriel is also very important. Raphael also very important. Now it's true that Christians are also calling and invoking those angels. But I think from like the Jewish perspective, they just be like, no, but the angels clearly only answer us, right? Like, so I think something can still be Jewish, even if other people are doing it and know about it, right?
Right. So, okay. So what I'm hearing is it's maybe a little sort of anachronistic or backward causation to assume this is mostly about anxiety about differentiating Jewish people from non-Jewish people. But it does seem from the evidence you present in your book, like there is anxiety among the rabbis of differentiating Jews from other kinds of Jews.
Yes.
Right. So like you talk about the sort of elite male rabbinic establishment that's in its formative period. And then a whole bunch of other Jews doing a whole bunch of other stuff that seems pretty unkosher by our modern lights. So talk to me, for example, about incantation bowls. You mentioned this a little in your overview at the beginning, but remind us, like, what are they, what purposes they served for ancient Jews? And are they ritual or are they magic?
Lots of great questions. So first of all, a Babylonian incantation bowl, they come in many sizes, but you can imagine something about the size of a cereal bowl, like made of very cheap plain ceramic. And someone has taken, an ink implement and written in spiral an incantation. They often start with a phrase, B'siyata d'Shemaya, right, with the help from the heavens. May rescue come to this couple or this person or this family. And they have a variety of concerns. From the incantations, we can tell that people are worried about, physical illness. They're worried about demons. They're worried about unidentified sounds in the night that are kind of scary. They're worried about other people's curses. They're worried about what their in-laws are saying about them. So I love these incantation bowls because they are so diverse, and each one was clearly written by some sort of ritual practitioner. Most of them are very defensive, right? When we say the word magic, right? Some students are probably like, yes, I love magic, Harry Potter, right? Some people are like, oh, magic, that's not okay, right? Magic is such a fraught word that in my book, I very quickly try to say, let's just call this ritual, right? Because these Jews didn't think they were doing anything weird, right? They were just like, we're appealing to God and God's angels to protect us from a variety of things. And what's weird about the incantation bowls is they seem to only be in use for about 4 centuries, from about the 4th century CE to the 8th century. And it's kind of a mystery kind of why they went out of style. We don't find any bowls in Roman Palestine or Byzantine Palestine, which is really strange, even though we find the same formulas in Babylonian incantation bowls and in necklace amulets from Roman Palestine. So there's clearly Jews are talking to each other, right, all over, right, from Roman Palestine to like Mesopotamia. They're exchanging formulas and ideas. Some of the bowls even quote the Mishnah, right? Some of our earliest bowls seem to like, they're aware of the Jewish liturgy. So these are Jews that are part of like Jewish orbit, but they are just found a different way to address their needs and concerns. And I find that really exciting. And it's why I decided to start the book with that evidence.
I love that you started the book with that. And I, for one, am bummed that incantation bowls went out of style because I think they're really cool and I kind of want one for myself.
You can make one.
And maybe design one. Yeah, it's interesting that you say some actually quote the Mishnah, because that does seem to show us that the makers and commissioners of these bowls didn't perceive themselves as being totally in opposition to the rabbinic project. But it is amazing, like when you read in your book the texts that are written on these bowls, and a lot of them are, ancient Jews appealing to angels to counteract the curses of their in-laws. It's so relatable. Ancient people, they're just like us, right?
Yeah.
And one thing that really struck me in terms of the difference between magic and ritual that you mentioned, you say that like a lot of the invocations in these bowls are largely sort of defensive as opposed to aggressive or coercive, right?
Yeah.
They're not trying to coerce the angels into doing their bidding. But I do want to talk to you about another genre of artifact that you bring up in the book, and that's amulets, which I have to say I'm very partial to. And in honor of tonight's event, I have worn my own amulet. This is from my Baghdadi family. So I thought I'd kind of like wear that tonight in honor of this. But the amulets you talk about in this book are far older. And you discuss the fact that certain ancient Jewish sources, like Sefer HaRazim, which you discuss in depth, basically were instruction manuals on how to make amulets to achieve specific purposes, like, for example, making someone else fall in love with you.
Yep.
And I want to read, I feel like the audience just needs to hear this. I want to read one love spell in particular. These are the kind of gems you will find if you get Professor Ahuvia's book. So just quickly, here's a quote from one of the amulets. If you wish to bring a great and wealthy and distinguished and beautiful woman to you so that she loves you, take some perspiration from your face and place it in a new glass vessel or flask and write on tinfoil the names of the angels and the name of the overseer and cast it into the glass and say thus over the perspiration of your face. I adjure you, overseer, and I adjure you, angels of favor and grace and angels of knowledge, that you will turn to me the heart of so-and-so, daughter of so-and-so, to love me and let her do nothing without me. Let not thoughts of me leave her mind, and let her heart be joined with my heart in love.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's pretty wild to me. This sounds kind of coercive to me. Is it fair to call this magic?
Yeah. So that quotation from Sefer HaRazim, I should say, what we think is going on in that text is that the introduction seems to be pretty old, like 4th century. It's beautiful Hebrew. All of the magic spells seem to be of a later date, which is interesting. It's like somebody took the opening and kept switching up and updating the spells with whatever they were using. And so it's much more common, I think, in the medieval era, like from the magic we find in the Cairo Geniza, to find what I call coercive love magic. And I hope we can introduce that into the lexicon. Often this is called, oh, Jewish love magic, erotic magic. Like, no, this is coercive.
Coercive
magic.
love magic.
Yeah, this is coercive. And yeah, it's really disturbing. Maybe we can linger on the fact for a moment that it's men commissioning it also, right? That it's men doing it to attract women. Whereas I think the stereotype is like witches doing it to seduce men.
Totally.
But yeah, this is the opposite. There is a whole book called Jewish Love Magic by Ortal Paz-Zar that looks at the medieval evidence for this. There's also a book of the curse tablets from written by Jews. So I didn't focus on this material because, let's say we have over 2,000 incantation bowls. I think like 30 so far have been found to be kind of more focused on cursing others. So, it is an important part of the Jewish past. But yeah, it's a really diverse world. I think that's one of the things that I found really exciting, because we often just talk about Judaism as so monolithic. And when we look at the ritual text, each one is different. Each one is interacting with God and the angels and other people kind of differently. And I found that just really like reassuring.
Yeah, I think like overall the impression of Judaism one gets from reading your book, at least what I got, is that Judaism is actually this polyvocal, multi-centered thing where lots of different individuals were finding lots of different ways to deal with their daily anxieties in a way that would, by invoking angels or by invoking God. And those were, sometimes at odds with what the mainstream rabbis wanted them to be doing.
Yeah.
I see that someone in the Q&A, a couple of people in the Q&A are already curious about like demons and are there female angels and demons? And so you touched on this a little in the overview, but I know that in your book, you do discuss some amulets that were intended for rescuing the wearer from demons. And I wonder if you could just say a word about, in the rabbinic imagination, how did angels relate to demons? And I also wonder if you could tell us about a specific, rather dark female angel known as Agrat, the daughter of Mahlat.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So first question, how do angels relate to demons? So thanks to Dan Brown, all of us believe, right? We have this category in our head, like we can't hear angels without demons. I was very surprised to read rabbinic literature and see that they don't usually put these two things together. They do it in one tradition that compares angels and demons, in which they say that both angels and demons have, wings and they fly and they know what's happening, like what the future will bring. But demons die, demons copulate, and demons eat and drink, which you might not have known. So that's like as close as we get also to like Jewish or rabbinic angelology and demonology. Like I wish the rabbis would just provide me with a definition, but the rabbis don't do that. And in the end, even if they did, it would just be the definition of like one particular rabbi at one point in time. Jews have been talking about angels for a very long time. If you've ever heard of like the idea of fallen angels, that actually comes from an ancient Jewish myth called the Book of the Watchers. This is part of a larger text called First Enoch. And it goes back to, we think, like 300 BCE, maybe earlier. Maybe you've noticed Genesis chapter 6 talking about, the sons of God mating with the daughters of man. Like that seems to be connected to the myth of angels departing their heavenly stations where they were supposed to be watching God, hence they're called the Watchers, and descending to mingle with human women, producing Nephilim, which we should probably translate as giants, which wreak havoc upon the earth, and then, the flood happens to fix everything. So the ancient myth of the Watchers explains that the archangels get involved here, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael. I think it's Uriel in that myth is the fourth. In some versions of the myth, it's 7 angels. They get involved also and help out with destroying these evil giants. The bodies of the giants are destroyed. Their spirits, however, remain. And their spirits become demons that haunt people and that like either like attach themselves to them bodily or just like want to consume food and are constantly hungry. So, I mean, that's the best explanation we have. To what extent late antique Jews knew about this idea of demonology is unclear. The rabbis in the Mishnah, which was composed around 200 CE, also kind of mention, oh, the demons were produced by God at the twilight of the sixth day. By the way, they're clearly not into the myth of the fallen angels and are trying to kind of redirect Jewish attention. So we don't need to go look for like foreign mythologies or demonologies to understand why Jews believed in demons. So, right, there's like insider paper trails for demons and angels. I hope that answers one question. I will say, like, the rabbis have many stories in which they combat demons. And the rabbis, they always want to present themselves as the only like authority figure you need. Like, you don't need an angel. If you have a demon that's haunted your front yard, just call me and I will expel this demon infestation from your home.
The ancient bed bugs.
Yeah, exactly. Right there. Yeah, exactly. They're a nuisance, those demons. Okay, so hopefully that's the one question. Let's talk about the feminine and the angels. And I will say this was the biggest surprise to me in the last 5 years. As I was revising my dissertation to write this book, I was kind of re-examining all of the evidence I'd collected. And I just remember in 2015, when I first came to UW and I first was lecturing about angels in ancient Judaism, a student asked me about whether there were female angels. And I told her, like, I'm so sorry, like, the evidence suggests, that the rabbis just, didn't, had this kind of sexist worldview and just didn't see like the feminine and the divine as commingling, and I could just see like she was so crestfallen by my answer, and that really like stayed with me. And I think because of that, as I was rereading the evidence, and like I just suddenly started like noticing, like, wait a second, like there are occasional clues to the fact that like angels weren't always masculine. And I first noticed this in a kind of a list in Yanai's poetry. He's a 6th century synagogue poet, where he sort of lists God creates, angels, male, female, spirits, demons. And I was like, wait, what did I just read? And I realized he was referring to masculine and feminine spirits. And then I found the same list in a rabbinic midrash. And I was like, where is this coming from? And I realized, at least later rabbis thought that this was an interpretation of a prophecy in Zechariah, which talks about winged women carrying, something out to Babylonia. And I just suddenly realized, like, oh, they had this point of departure for like winged angelic beings. And once I kind of like opened my mind to that, I noticed that there were traditions in which the rabbis have encounters with these problematic beings, which in the past have been interpreted as demons. And Agrat, the daughter of Machlat, is one of them. And what caught my eye about this tradition of this Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa encountering this being was that Agrat is walking around with 18,000, right, retinue of beings behind her. And I was like, 18 is usually like a very positive number in Judaism, right? It has to do with like life. All the way already in the Psalm, we see, play on the number 18. And I was like, is it possible to read this as an angelic being? Because I also kind of knew from my research that there are these angels who are sort of angels of the good, right? Who are monitoring your good deeds. And there are angels who are always kind of monitoring your transgressions so that, your deeds can be properly weighed in the afterlife. And I was like, what if she's one of these, like the angels of monitoring transgressions? And I just realized, like, it just sort of fell into place. And it makes sense that from the rabbinic perspectives, your masculine angels are good, feminine angels are, on a lower, let's say more inferior in the hierarchy. But if we go beyond rabbinic circles, right, and if we go back to like those images of the synagogue lintels that I showed you, where the angels are clearly depicted as feminine, I was suddenly like, oh, like when Jews went to the synagogue and we're told to imitate, that they were just like the angels when they're prayed. What
Mhm.
were women imagining, right? Women
Right.
were clearly imagining angels that looked like themselves. And when they're, people are told to like, oh, tell your angels to wait for you when you go to the bathroom. Like, yeah, I'm sure men were imagining masculine angels, but women were probably imagining, right, feminine angels or angels that looked like them, right? So I just realized I needed to, there was like a, a gender spectrum, and respecting the evidence meant opening up my mind to that.
Right. I was so struck by in this story that's in your book about Rabbi Hanina Mendoza encountering Agrat, who's this destructive sort of angel, marauding through the streets, wreaking havoc, and but he's this kind of like folk hero figure who is so righteous that he kind of has ability to control her and like keep her within bounds. And so he sort of says, you're no longer going to be allowed to go marauding through the streets, like destroying everyone's life every night of the week. But maybe Wednesdays before Shabbat, okay, like 2 evenings of the week, it's okay. Yeah. And I guess, first of all, it shows, the rabbis positioning a fellow rabbi as like, we have power to control this like destructive angelic force. But it also reminded me of a more modern dibuk, Jewish folktale, right, where there's this story of this evil spirit, this malign spirit, this dibuk, that cannot be banished entirely from the house, but can be consigned to the attic. It echoed for me in this more ancient story with, seems like the rabbis have this idea of, all right, we can't entirely control them, but we can partly control them, and we have to some degree know how to coexist with these invisible forces.
Yeah, that seems to be the case, especially with demons, that you can't necessarily kill them, but you can definitely expel them. You can divorce them, but you can't necessarily get rid of them forever. And yeah, I mean, I think that what I found useful for thinking of the angels of destruction is that they're a little bit like the police force of the invisible realm. Like, you don't want to run into them necessarily, but they're keeping order. Like, they're not, demons are like totally out of order and like causing havoc, but like angels of transgression, like you don't want them around, but like they just like they have to be around, and they serve an important role in the kind of invisible realm that ancient Jews envision.
Right. And the ancient rabbis are still positioning them as part of God's plan, right? Like they're all under that heading of being subservient to God and just like carrying out God's will. It's, you show at the beginning of the book that the early rabbis were trying to do everything they could to downplay angels, but by a certain point, it just becomes clear that all this angel stuff is just irresistible to ancient Jews. They like love it. They can't get enough of it. Why do you think that angels proved so irresistible to them? That is to the point that eventually the rabbis kind of had no choice but to incorporate them more fully into their worldview and come up with these stories about how some righteous rabbis can somewhat control them. Like, why is it so sticky, so catchy?
It's a good question. I think this brings up like how different we are, right, from ancient people. Like, how do we get in their shoes? And I mean, I guess the subtle explanation I come up with is in the synagogue, at least, I think the prayer leaders were really successful in integrating angels into Jewish life. Like, it's very clear that in their churches, Christians are telling Christians to be angelic, and look, the angels are right here when you pray with you. And it's clear that the Jewish prayer leaders are saying, look, you're actually in synchronicity with the heavenly realm, when you pray, like, and you don't need to be a nun to be angelic. You can reproduce, and in doing so, you are still being just like the angels. So I must have made them feel less alone, more close to God. It must have enabled them to see the divine as present in their daily life. Like one of the things that surprised me was all the evidence in all the strata of rabbinic literature for belief in guardian angels. I assumed that would be very late. It's actually pretty early. So yeah, when people were on the road, I guess that's a time when you feel particularly vulnerable. Like you want to imagine angels of peace surrounding you. And I think eventually that's what the Babylonian rabbi said, okay, like this is a part of the Jewish imagination. How do we use it to encourage Jews to follow Sabbath law, right? How do we use it to encourage them to follow rabbinic law and customs? And I think that it was just useful. There's, sometimes we can do things for self-satisfaction, but maybe we want that gold star, that sticker, that affirmation, and maybe like imagining angelic affirmation just was really attractive to ancient people.
It sounds almost like the rabbis came to this point of thinking, if you can't beat him, join him, right?
Yes.
This is such a part of the lived religion of the people at this point. We just have to fold it in somehow. And yeah, as you're saying, we start to see rabbis embellishing these stories of, if you walk home from synagogue on a Friday night and you have a nice lamp lit and a nice clean house and a good meal for the Sabbath, it makes a good, the angels are pleased with you. You're going to have another Shabbat like that again in the future. And if you prepare poorly for the Shabbat, the angels are kind of pissed at you, and you're going to have another kind of not so great Shabbat in the future. So it seems like, using this idea of angels now kind of to encourage Jews to keep the halakha, the Jewish law that the rabbis want them to be keeping.
Yeah, exactly. I guess what's interesting about the rabbis too is that we see that they have their own preferences, right? Like when they imagine someone, mediating between them and God, it's Elijah, right? Like, but it's interesting that, I guess most observant Jews, right, believe that Elijah visits them right on Passover, goes all over the world, but like Elijah was good for the rabbis, but most Jews preferred Michael and Gabriel, and Raphael. Yeah.
More personable.
Yes. Exactly.
I mean, Elijah's like the very epitome of like a lofty character who, is somewhat unreachable, but except for Passover night.
Yeah.
But you touched on this at the beginning, in our more modern era, basically, starting around 1900 or so, we see a move in the opposite direction, right? Earlier on, the rabbis kind of said, fine, we'll embrace this whole angel thing if you insist. Then we see, this move away, this move to sort of rationalize Judaism, to kind of maybe sanitize it, we could say, by exorcising angels from the religion.
Yeah,
what is lost for us as modern, postmodern people when we do that, when we buy into that sort of more sanitized or rationalized picture of this ancient religion?
Yeah, I think when we do that, and I should admit, like Maimonides also had some like kind of Aristotelian rationalizing tendencies, but most medieval Jews didn't follow Maimonides in downplaying demons and angels. It's really only, I think, in the 19th, 20th century that we start seeing Jewish studies scholars kind of asserting this authority and making these claims more loudly. So what's lost? I think what I see is that too many Jews, I think, define Judaism through Protestant Christian terms. What I mean, I think that they concede too much ground to, when I say I work on angels, people are like, oh, aren't angels Christians? And I'm like, no, yeah, angels are Jewish. And they're like, well, isn't Judaism a religion of law? And I'm like, Judaism is also a religion of relationships with the divine world. And I think we make our like religious traditions like illegible, like we render so much of like midrash, so many Jewish stories, so many like Jewish liturgy, so much like Jewish ritual, Jewish like amulets, like it's impossible to understand these things if you don't understand the role of these relationships with invisible beings in Jewish life for most of history. So, I think I see sometimes like, on Twitter, like, Jews who really take pride in the fact that that one can be Jewish and secular, that one can be Jewish and like not believe in God. And, that's fine and well, and good. And everybody can define Judaism in their own way. But I just think it's important to note that like Judaism was very popular in the ancient world. And it was popular precisely because like Jews did feel like they were in a world that was ultimately beneficent, right? Like, contrary to the persecution that they faced, angels and God were on their side. And I don't know. I always feel like this stuff like, like, it's just too bad that you so want to see Judaism as like rational and scripted and like even like legalistic. Like, I hear Jews say these things that are so clearly like examples of Christian anti-Judaism. And I'm like, you really don't have to try so hard. Like, it's okay to say that Judaism was also relational and also cared about ritual, but also really cared about relationships with the divine. So I think we just lose this like whole dimension.
Right. It's sort of an impoverishing of what the religion was and can be, both in the sense that you're making your own, textual traditions illegible to yourself. The Bible is chock full of angels. If you're denying angels, it's very hard to deal with those parts of the Bible. And in the sense that you're kind of maybe robbing the religion of the opportunity to present this feeling of personal intimacy with this divine realm, right? It's not some like abstract, rational, lofty Kantian imperative up there. It's something more close to here.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, how it's really struck me how many times I've said I work on angels, and there were like people ask me, well, where are angels in Judaism today? And I'm like, well, do you sing Shalom Aleichem on Friday night? Do you say the Kedusha in synagogue with the holy, holy, holy? Like, you're you're following really ancient practices of inviting the angels to be with you or to imitate the angels. But like they're like, oh yeah, I hadn't noticed that, right? And they hadn't noticed that because they've been taught not to see it. Mm-hmm. So people, I think, have been taught not to see a really large part of their tradition.
Right. It's almost like multiple times this idea of angels has been suppressed in Jewish history, early on by the early rabbis, and then in the modern era by this whole project to sort of rationalize and modernize Judaism. Okay. In terms of I want to ask you one last question and then open it up to questions from everyone else, which, by the way, everyone here, if you have other questions, keep them coming. They're great. I did just want to ask about, how you conceive of your project here in this book, how you see it fitting into the wider sort of scholarship on this topic. It strikes me that, you make this move in the book where you purposely draw on, you're not just looking at the Talmud here or the Midrash. We're looking at incantation bowls. We're looking at amulets. We're looking at these sort of artifacts that not just the elite male rabbinic establishment used, but really everyone, including women, commissioned and used to feel closer to God and the divine. So is part of what we lose if we let ourselves forget what a big role angels did play for ancient Jews, and if we sort of revert back to this view of Judaism as just the way the ancient rabbis perceive, the rabbinic male elite wanted to paint it, do we lose, if we do that, the view from women's perspective? And in some way, by you recuperating these other artifacts, do you see your project here as a feminist one?
Okay. Lots of really big, important questions there. Okay, I guess one of the things that it was important for me to show is that the rabbis themselves have lots of opinions amongst them, right? So some of them are definitely, like Rabbi Akiva and his followers through the generations, are definitely like, stop with the angels, focus on God. Other rabbis are clearly like, it's okay, like angels are accompanying us, it's fine. So I don't mean to like paint the rabbis as like monolithically against angels. They're really not. I would say like the real like articulated anti-angelic stance is much more modern. It's much more like 19th, 20th century. But I think by decentering the rabbis, even though 3 of my chapters are about the rabbis, I do think like I'm saying, hey, like maybe we can start talking about religion by looking like, looking at more Jewish opinions. Like I don't want to say that like Rihanna is like a feminist thinker, but it does strike me that because the poet Yanai was in the synagogue and there were also women in front of him, that he is a little bit more inclusive. And I really appreciate that. And with the ritual text, I really appreciate that many of the clients were women and we get to hear what they're concerned about, right? And some would even argue that some incantations were written by women, and I don't see why not. Like the first incantation bowl in my book is like everything, written by men and women. So like the incantation bowls themselves speak to like women participating in this text. So is it, a feminist project? I guess in the sense that I believe in the, equal integrity of all people, regardless of their gender, but also regardless of their like location. Like if Jews in this region that produce the incantation bowls, other rabbis in the north tended to make fun of them as having impure lineage, because this area was often conquered and had enslaved people. I'm not willing to adopt the like prejudices of the rabbis and only look at rabbis of pure lineage to inform us about what Judaism is, right? Like to me, it's like, are you behaving like a Jew? Are you appealing to Jewish sources? Are you writing in a Jewish language? Like if you fit those three things, like that's enough, right? So, and yeah, I do think that the field of religion needs to include more voices. And I think I do join, the recent generation of scholars that is trying to, I think, be more inclusive, look to lived religious experience, including ritual, magical evidence, liturgical experience, right? For many decades, people found prayer very boring. I hope in my book you find out that prayer is not boring. Prayer is very exciting and can tell us a lot about how people imagine their day-to-day lives. So I hope that answered some of your questions.
We do, I assure you, we do find in this book that prayer and these texts are like the opposite of boring. They're wild and really cool. And I'm very glad, personally, very glad and grateful that there are scholars like you, that you are part of this crop of scholars who are bringing more of these voices into the frame. And I think that is only enriching our picture of what the religion was and can be. And with that, I'm going to put to you some of these amazing questions that people have asked. I'm loving the questions, everybody. We already touched on some of them, but let's see. I wanted to bring up Rebecca K asked a question. About a couple of folks have actually asked the questions about what differentiates beliefs and use of incantation bowls or amulets from other non-Jewish groups during this era. I know often there was overlap, but often they were completely different. And then another person asked, about the, in what ways did non-Jewish views of angels from others living in Babylonia influence the Jews? So can you just say a word about like what might have been the influences of other cultures on these bowls and amulets versus like to what extent can we say these are quintessentially Jewish?
Yeah, so I should mention incantation bowls are super interesting because 70% of them have been identified as being kind of written in Jewish Aramaic, but the rest have been written in Syriac. There was a Christian dialect of Aramaic, in Persian. So it is interesting that these were clearly used by multiple Abrahamic adjacent communities, but mostly Jews. And the scholars who first excavated this were really like flustered by this ratio, because they were like, oh, Jews are monotheistic. Why are they engaged in these ritual texts, and they really tried to, they were kind of at the periphery of scholarship for a while. And then some scholars were like, well, maybe Jews are writing this, but for other people, not for Jews. And I think that's kind of a silly explanation.
Kind of mental gymnastics.
Yeah. It does seem like Jews were particularly scribal. There's this kind of scribalization of magic. It is sometimes called by Gideon Bohak, who wrote the book on ancient Jewish magic. The differences I see is, Christian magic tends to appeal to Christian divinities, including Jesus. So I see that and I'm like, okay, like this person clearly defined themselves in allegiance with these figures. So I tended to focus on incantation bowls that appealed only to God or just to angels, or like that were very clearly written in Jewish, like they had to fulfill a number of factors. They had to be in a place that was possibly Jewish or appeal only to Jewish divinities and be written like in a Jewish language. Although, there are also Greek magical texts. So from Egypt, we have many Greek magical texts, but they tend to appeal to a variety of like Christian divinities or like local divinities, even as sometimes they appeal to biblical divinities. I mean, what's interesting about Christian magic is they make their allegiances very clear, or they have like crosses. So even if they also appeal to Michael and Gabriel and Moses and Abraham, which they do, they then also like really mark themselves as fitting a different community. And you can also sometimes tell by the names, although names aren't always a great sign, because Jews tended to have the names of local people, right? They don't tend to have the names that we expect. There are differences between what we find in Babylonian Jewish magic and Jewish magics from Roman Palestine. I guess the biggest difference, unfortunately, is that the Babylonian magical texts are much longer. They just give us a lot more information. Texts from Palestine are much shorter because they were usually kind of rolled up in amulets and worn around the neck. So there is a lot more space in Babylonian incantations for long lists of names, including of the demonic. Palestinian magic just tends to be much more focused on like one issue or like the evil eye, but Babylonians tend to try to like they fill in that space around the incantation bowl with many concerns. So yeah,
I've kind of got my fingers crossed that hopefully maybe we'll, have new excavations that will uncover new Palestinian sources that we haven't seen yet. Give you some more to work with.
I hope so.
We can always hope. Britta Simon asked an interesting question here, curious more about the Nephilim, which you alluded to earlier in Genesis. The Hebrew Bible in the Pentateuch book of Genesis contains an interesting passage that seems to complement the ideology of humankind as descendants of Adam and Eve. A group of beings who are called Nephilim, or sons of God, come down to earth, have intercourse with women, and thus help populate the earth. I've heard interpretations of these beings, Nephilim, as giants and or as fallen angels. This would make humans, oops, sorry, that text just disappeared from my, just a moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can also look
sorry. You can start speaking to that. Sorry,
yeah.
Here it is. This would make humans descendants of angels, closely related. Can you please share with us your interpretation of the passage? Do you consider an interpretation of Nephilim as fallen angels likely?
Okay, so I think if you read the text really closely, the sons of God, it's the Bnei Elim who mate with the daughters of man, and then Nephilim are upon the earth. So the Nephilim are clearly the offspring of the angels and the women, right? And these angels, they're the fallen angels. So humans have a separate genealogy. Although I will say that there's this interesting discussion among ancient thinkers about whether humans are created in the image of God or the image of the angels, right? So some rabbis even say, well, actually humans are made in the image of Gabriel, right? Because Gabriel's name just means Gever, right? Which is like man of God. Right. So, some ancient sources believe that humans were made in the image of the angels. And, if you read Genesis, right, let us make human, right, in our image. Yep. This "our," like the plural, has been, defined as like the royal we, but it can also be like God referring to like all the angels around him, right? So, yeah. Hope that clarifies things. But, the myth of the Watchers was very popular among Jews and Christians. Jewish and Christian authorities did not like it. The rabbis tried to suppress the myth. Annette Yushiko Reed has written the books about this, including a very recent book on angels, demons, and writings. This is focused on the Hellenistic era. This is like 300 to 100 BCE, whereas my book focuses on this time period much later, after the synagogue, after the temple has been destroyed and the synagogues are become more ascendant, and the rabbis are starting to organize themselves. But rabbis didn't like the myth of the angels because it seemed to offer an explanation for why there was evil in the world that didn't relate to human responsibility, right? And ultimately, Christian authorities and Jewish authorities want us all to locate evil in the world as being the result of human action, right, or inaction. But the myth of the Watcher seems to say, you know what, there's demons and chaos because of something these angelic beings did, 1,000 years ago. And like, that's not really useful for the rabbis and Christian priests to work with. So they really try to repress it, but it is fascinating, right? It's such a beautiful idea that like, even people who have never read this text, like they know the fallen angels,
Right. It's almost scarier psychologically to imagine that evil in the world is not due to human action, because then you've got to deal with this concept that some forces utterly beyond your control or knowledge could be doing things, and that's why you're dealing with problems on earth. So I can kind of understand how they might have wanted to distance from that. Janine Edme Hakim has a question that may be relating to slightly later Judaism than what you mostly deal with in this book, but the question is there a difference between Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, and other, for example, Ethiopian practices or maybe traditions related to angels?
I mean, probably, right? I mean, the practices around angels are very regional and idiosyncratic. So I am sure that there are, amongst like certain places, certain angels are probably more popular than others. Certain texts are more popular than other texts. So I don't know as much about the modern period, but you have amulets in your family. My colleague Anna Gomez Bravo brought me back amulets from Poland. So like you can find these everywhere. So it's true that Jewish ritual practitioners share things, and we're now living in an age of mass marketing. But if you go back a few hundred years, you probably would find kind of regional variation in how Jews appeal to angels, and it's particularly in amulets.
Mm-hmm. I'll just toss out there that this amulet, which belonged to my Jewish grandmother born in Bombay, and her grandmother there before her, is a regional sort of illustration of this, in the sense that it's a melding of Judaism and Hindu practices, in a sense, because contained in these bulbs is a black root that Hindu women used to keep on their person in a sort of amulet parallel. And so that root is sort of encapsulated in this amulet that has been sort of made Jewish with the addition of a chamsa, a hand, and a little blue jewel for the evil eye. So I think, what you're saying about the regionality, right? Like the culture of the region definitely seeps into whatever the Jewish traditions are, and vice versa.
Yeah, and Jews Judaize things, right? I think that's a really interesting example, like Jews Judaizing like a local practice and making it their own. So.
Yeah. Jews gonna Judaize. I think we might have time for possibly one or two more questions. Someone wanted you to just explain what is the meaning of your book's title.
Oh, thank you so much for asking that.
Yeah, get a really good fundamental question here.
So this is from a very famous Jewish prayer, invocation of angels on all sides. It's become part of the Orthodox nighttime Shema. We first find it in a liturgical book. Well, we find it in a liturgical context in the 11th century, but we find it in incantation bowls first. This is a very common invocation. So it'll say like, on my right, Michael, or sometimes it has other names, on my left, Gabriel, in front of me, Uriel, behind me, some other angels, the Shekhinah, so, right, the kind of divine presence of God is above me. It's a really beautiful, very popular prayer. When I first encountered it in the incantation bowl context, Shaul Shaked, very important scholar of magic, noted that you find similar formulas in like Middle Persian and in other languages. And I was like, oh, wow, is this prayer like not even of Jewish origin? And then if you read chapter 3 in my book about like early rabbinic texts, I encountered a rabbinic midrash about how when the Israelites were in the wilderness in the desert, they had these clouds of glory around them on their right and on their left and in front of them and behind them and below them and above them. And I was like, this sounds extremely similar to the angelic invocation. Instead of angels, they were kind of clouds of glory. But I just think this is a very comforting image. And I see kind of the ritual practitioners kind of being in the same orbit as the rabbis. And whenever they hear something that they think is like very invocative, they're like, oh, we're going to use that. And like once it passes into ritual use, then yeah, other ritual practitioners hear about it. And sometimes it gets, disseminated to other people. But this is, I would say, one of the most popular and beautiful prayers. And so I quoted kind of the what's become the kind of traditional Orthodox Jewish prayer, but it has very ancient origins and many different variations. So yeah, thanks for that question.
Great. And finally, a couple of people here are curious about how Lilith or Lilith fits into all of this. About, are there female angels who assist women in childbirth? Is Lilith a demon, an angel? Can you say a little bit about her?
Yes. There haven't really great articles written about Lilith, but she's difficult to pin down as a figure because we do find Lilith in the plural and in the incantation bowls, where it's clearly a reference to a demonic being. We also have much later Jewish medieval legends about Lilith being the first wife of Adam, rejected, adopted by feminists today because she, was defiant of Adam. So there's this demonic lineage for her. Like some historians think that she is like a Judaization of an ancient Babylonian deity called Lamashtu. So it's very difficult to say. I think it's only in the modern context that we see her really turned into a positive angelic figure. But someone asked about whether there was a female angel that assisted at birth. And so there's this angel called Lila, which Lila in Hebrew is like, it's sort of looks feminine, but it's actually masculine. And I have an article coming out on angels and gender. And I thought about using Layla as an example, but the thing is, whenever you find things in the rabbinic context, they're rabbinicized. And so Layla is clearly depicted as a masculine being in rabbinic texts, but who's to say that, among ancient Jewish women, this wasn't perceived as a feminine being. I will say that one of my favorite amulets from the ancient world calls on the 4 matriarchs, Bilhah, Rachel, Zilpah, and Leah, to help out at the time of childbirth, and calls on other angels as well. What's cool about those particular 4 matriarchs, which are probably not the 4 matriarchs you recognize, right? These are the 4 wives of Jacob, including his secondary wives. The acronym of their name spells iron, and iron in the ancient world was believed to repel the demonic. So that's really cool. So there's some really neat traditions that are associated with the matriarchs and the angels, right? So it's another good example of like a different combination of beings to assist women. And that particular amulet was to assist in like a healthy pregnancy, but also to prevent bad periods. So that's nice.
Great. We need this amulet. We need to resurrect this amulet. That's amazing. That's so interesting. I just want to, I'm sorry to those of you whose questions we didn't get to, but we did get to a lot of themes brought up by your great questions. Professor Ahuvia, I just want to say people are full of praise for this book and also already giving you book ideas for your next works.
Oh, perfect. Okay, I will read. Feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer questions and book recommendations. And we'll also send a follow-up email.
Great. Elizabeth Fallsberg wants you to write a book on Chagall, Klee, and Benjamin that you alluded to at the beginning. So, got some good things to work with here.
Great. Wonderful.
But with that, we're out of time. So I want to thank all of you for joining us and to say thank you Thank you again to our really generous supporters, the support of our community of donors of the Strom Center. They make events like today's possible. And if you'd like to make a gift, you can visit our website. And just a reminder that if you're interested in purchasing this book, which I highly recommend, you can use the promo code that's on the screen, 17M6662. On the UC Press website, you'll get 30% off at checkout. That promo code will also be included in a post-event email that will be sent to you. So keep a lookout for that. And finally, save the date for our screening and conversation with the director of The Hangman, which is a film about Shalom Nagar, the Yemenite Jew who guarded and eventually executed Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann. That's on Monday, October 25th at 7 p.m. So thank you, Professor Ahuvia. Thank you everyone for coming and listening. And we will now end the webinar. Thank you all.